In the Routledge Handbook of Panpsychism, David Chalmers writes, "While I was in graduate school, I recall hearing, one starts as a materialist, then one becomes a dualist, then a panpsychist, and one ends up as an idealist." In this video, I'm going to explain how and why one ends up as an idealist. I'm not going to argue that panpsychism is false, but rather if one holds this view, then they should combine their panpsychism with idealism. Both of these views hold that the mental is fundamental. What distinguishes them is that the former holds the mental as ubiquitous, while the latter holds it as exhaustive. On its face, these definitions do not contradict each other, so it's possible for both to be true. To examine the motivations for combining these views, we can start by examining the motivations for panpsychism.
And I think the attraction of panpsychism is it gives us a way of integrating consciousness into our scientific picture of the world, and in a way that avoids the deep difficulties that plague the other options, such as materialism or dualism.
They often propose this view as an alternative to physicalism and dualism, to dissolve issues like the hard problem of consciousness and the interaction problem. But as Professor David Skrbina points out in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, panpsychism in itself is not a theory of mind per se, because it does not in general give an account of the precise nature of mind, nor of how it relates to material things. Rather, it is a meta-theory. It is a theory about theories, a framework which says, however mind is to be conceived, it applies in some sense to all things. Thus, panpsychism can apply, in principle, to virtually any conventional theory of mind. So one can be a physicalist, dualist, or even an idealist and still be a panpsychist. Some would argue neutral monism is an option, but this is something I will address later in the video. The main point is that panpsychism per se is not an alternative to physicalism or dualism. They would have to accept a certain theory of mind, like idealism or neutral monism, in order to really present an alternative. Russellian monism is another view that is often presented as an alternative.
So recently rediscovered ideas of Bertrand Russell and Arthur Eddington, who's incidentally the first scientist to confirm general relativity. He's also a keen philosophy enthusiast, from the 1920s have led to a view that promises to avoid both the problems facing physicalism and the problems facing dualism. So this is the view that's become known as Russellian monism.
Russellian monism is the view that a single set of properties underlies both consciousness and the most basic entities posited by physics. However, we see the same issue with Russellian monism as we did with panpsychism. It is possible to identify varieties that correspond to more traditional theories, including physicalism, idealism, neutral monism, and even dualism. As long as one holds to structuralism about physics, realism about quiddities, and quidditism about consciousness, then that's sufficient to make one a Russellian monist, and it's possible to hold all of these commitments while holding either of the conventional theories of mind. So just as with panpsychism, Russellian monism per se is not an alternative to physicalism or dualism. What I think attracts panpsychists to explore how Russell and Eddington dissolve these problems is not their Russellian monism, but rather their idealism. Bertrand Russell was implicitly an idealist, as I'll explain in this section on the mentalism suspicion, and Arthur Eddington was more explicit in his idealism, stating that the stuff of the world is mind stuff.
Indeed, it has often gone unrecognized that the modern Russell-Eddington panpsychism is itself a form of idealism. The apparent conflict between panpsychism and idealism might be just a matter of from which side we choose to begin.
If either the panpsychist or Russellian monist wants to hold to a different view from physicalism or dualism, then they need to get more fundamental and accept something like idealism or neutral monism. To see why the panpsychist should prefer idealism over neutral monism, we can examine the main arguments that are used for panpsychism.
So the slogan is, nothing can give what it does not possess. So if matter doesn't at least possess some primitive form of mentality, how is it able to produce complex form of mentality? So for simplicity reasons and to understand the evolution of the mind, panpsychists assume that some primitive mental properties are ubiquitous and fundamental in all of reality.
In formulating this argument, Usually the concept is that there are irreducible physical objects that have fundamental properties such as mass, spin, and charge, and in addition, there are irreducible mental properties, which are also fundamental. However, formulating panpsychism this way turns out to be a version of non-reductive physicalism, or property dualism, that merely denies emergence. Though this avoids the problems of emergence, this leaves them vulnerable to fatal objections, as I explained in my previous video, called the failures of property dualism. In short, a duality of properties opens the door to the interaction problem and other issues regarding mental causation, and the main theories of substance means they will lapse into a version of substance dualism. To dissolve these fatal problems, panpsychists such as Peter Els are beginning to combine their view with idealism.
I see it as being moving more to an idealistic conception, because although panpsychism solves a lot of problems in the philosophy of mind, it doesn't solve the problem of mental causation. Now, if you remain a physicalist and become a panpsychist, you're still left with all the problems that Kim explained about causal overdetermination, or the mind being an epiphenomenon. You've just moved the problem down from the level of biology to the level of microphysics. But if you take this idealistic view, then that particular problem goes away.
Another important argument to examine is the intrinsic nature argument.
The world must have some intrinsic nature which underpins the relational properties that it exemplifies. So if we look around at what science reveals about the world, science and physics in particular shows us these relational structures amongst elements. It does not tell us what the actual nature of these things are. And from the point of view of panpsychism, this leaves a kind of opening where the intrinsic nature could be consciousness itself.
The panpsychist who wields the intrinsic nature argument is saying something a bit different than the property dualist version of panpsychism we saw earlier. Proponents of the intrinsic nature argument hold that physics only describes the structure of something, or in other words, it only tells us what it does, rather than what it is. The intrinsic nature of something is what something is. If the intrinsic nature of all things is consciousness, then what all things are is consciousness. Instead of saying consciousness is a fundamental and irreducible property of the physical, they're saying what the physical is simply is consciousness. And this is indistinguishable from idealism. Even Thomas Nagel has noted, Russell's view that the intrinsic nature of the physical brain process is mental is too much like reducing the physical to the mental. Adrian David Nelson, who is perhaps the most prominent panpsychist podcaster, stated in a comment on his most recent documentary that he agrees the intrinsic nature argument leads to a form of idealism. If the intrinsic nature of reality is consciousness, then reality is consciousness, and though accepting this entails accepting idealism, one can still maintain panpsychism in light of this.
My own particular take on panpsychism is a kind of idealist take. It's very close to Russellian monism. I do believe in the existence of mental properties and physical properties, but my view is that all physical properties, even so-called fundamental physical properties such as mass and charge, can be reduced without remainder to mental properties.
The idealist who reduces the physical to the mental is not denying the existence of entities such as tables and chairs. What they're holding is that tables and chairs are mental instead of holding them to be physical. There are many ways to conceptualize a reduction of the physical to the mental, but I'll offer two examples. One comes from Peter Els, who holds that length is a combination and reconciliation of structural information from the percepts of all the experiencers that perceive it, including the experiencers that make up the object. Michael Pelchar reduces space and time to logical constructions out of a certain kind of potential for conscious experience. which I think can also be the case of actual conscious experience. Even Philip Goff notes that philosophical ghosts are possible. Zombies are bodies without minds, creatures that are physically identical to actual human beings, but which have no conscious experience. In contrast to zombies, there are creatures who are conscious, but whose nature is exhausted by their being conscious. We can call such a purely conscious creature a ghost. It is possible to conceive of ourselves and the world as ghosts, whose nature is exhausted by conscious experience, meaning it's possible there's nothing more to us than consciousness. But why should the panpsychists prefer this view over the alternative of neutral monism? To answer that, we must first examine this view. Neutral monism is the view that ultimate reality is all of one kind, but the intrinsic nature of reality is neither mental nor physical. If one is affirming the intrinsic nature argument, then on its face, panpsychism is incompatible with neutral monism. It's contradictory to hold the intrinsic nature of reality is mental and non-mental. On the face of it, panpsychism and neutral monism are strikingly different. Neutral monism reduces mental and physical phenomena. Panpsychism does not. Neutral monism holds that basic reality is neutral. Panpsychism does not. And neutral monism is compatible with the view that most physical objects and all their parts are absolutely non-mental, where panpsychism is not. So it appears that panpsychism cannot be combined with neutral monism unless we're holding to a different view of neutrality. The preferable and most used view is the neither view, but as noted before, that conflicts with the intrinsic nature argument and so is not available to the panpsychist. They could instead hold to the both view, in which a basic entity is neutral just in case it is intrinsically both mental and physical. But as noted, this turns out to be a dual aspect theory, which turns out to be a form of dualism, which conflicts with the motivations of panpsychists. One could hold to another view of neutrality, but the main options that are available fail to say anything about the nature of neutral entities. They only tell us what neutral entities are not, rather than what they are, and they only specify certain roles neutral entities play, rather than telling us the nature of neutral entities. One can embrace this agnosticism, but that conflicts with one of the main motivations of panpsychism, which is to positively identify the intrinsic nature of reality. The original neutral monists made attempts to identify what these neutral entities are, but they fell prey to the mentalism suspicion. The most frequent type of objection to the traditional versions of neutral monism is that they are all forms of mentalistic monism, Berkeleyan idealism, panpsychism, or phenomenalism. The argument is simple. Sensations, pure experience, and sensations/percepts are paradigms of non-neutral mental entities. Hence, there is nothing neutral about these versions of neutral monism. The prima facie plausibility of this objection is beyond doubt. So the traditional versions of neutral monism lapse into a version of idealism, which makes the view a mental monism and therefore is not a real alternative to idealism. More recent versions of neutral monism that attempt to escape the mentalism suspicion end up facing the problem of experience. Experience cannot be reduced to or constructed from the non-experiential, so assuming that the neutral must be non-experiential, it follows that the neutral monist world has no room for experience. This is a point that's made even by Galen Strawson, and this is basically the hard problem of consciousness, but in terms of neutral entities instead of physical entities. If we are motivated to dissolve the hard problem, then this version of neutral monism won't help us. But what about a version that doesn't reduce consciousness? I would argue that since properties or aspects are part or all of the metaphysical nature of the substance, then there would have to be a mental substance to bear the mental properties or aspects. And in that sense, it wouldn't be a neutral monism, it would lapse into neutral dualism. Either they lapse into a kind of monistic idealism with the mentalism suspicion, or the irreducibility of consciousness will make them lapse into neutral dualism. So neutral monism is not neutral or monistic, which would therefore make idealism the only true monistic option from the main theories of mind. In conclusion, of the main theories available, idealism is the only one that delivers what the contemporary panpsychist is seeking. There's no interaction problem or hard problem of explaining consciousness in terms of non-consciousness, because consciousness is exhaustive of reality. Idealism champions simplicity due to the unity and comprehensibility of the fundamental properties, and is superior in its explanatory power by providing a straightforward story on causal interaction. It's not necessary to posit a different kind of property or aspect to reality beyond consciousness, so idealism enjoys a default position that rightfully puts the burden of proof on any view that claims there is an irreducible, non-experiential reality beyond consciousness. Even most of the main influencers of panpsychism in modern philosophy also accepted idealism, so idealism and panpsychism are right at home together and traditionally go hand in hand. So we're back where we started. One comes to think there is little reason to believe in anything beyond consciousness, and that the physical world is wholly constituted by consciousness, thereby endorsing idealism.